Good morning or afternoon, depending on what part of the country that you are in. My name's Josh Gilland. I'm one of the founding attorneys of the Legal Geeks. And we're here to really, really rock out with the wonderful, fun issues of the Heiress, which I was not expecting to see that character so quickly, and it was very rewarding Friday morning. So with that, with me today is Nari Ely and Thomas Harper. How are each of you doing?
Doing pretty good. Had an interesting weekend in DC. I'll just leave it at that.
What possibly could be happening in our nation's capital? What could it be? So
a few guests joining your city.
Yeah. There's a few guests. It looks like the tourists are back. How about that?
Yeah. All right, Tom, how you doing?
I'm good. Watching these episodes at like 4 a.m. on Friday, which is my normal routine, is good because I get to watch, get it into my system early in the morning. But it's bad because I was like Kevin McAllister in Home Alone after the episode where I'm just running around the basement with nobody to talk to. You guys are both asleep like normal people, and spoilers are no good, even if you did have somebody to talk to online.
Yeah, I'm now used to waking up to text messages from you, and I see nothing wrong with that. It'd be weird if you didn't. So
I used to pause and I would consider whether to send it. Like, well, is it inconsiderate to send it since it's like 1 a.m. his time? And I'm like, that pause is no longer there anymore. I just hit send.
Yeah, because if I do wake up at say like 3 a.m., I'll watch it just because it's that eagerness that I haven't experienced since childhood. And that's a really unique feeling. For example, I love Star Trek Discovery, but I don't get up early to watch it. I watch that after work, after dinner, and I'm completely happy that way. This, I'm eager to see it like a 5-year-old. And that says a lot about the power of this TV show. And I know I'm not the only one who feels that way watching it before dawn. Nari, are you before dawn or after work, or what's your
After
routine
work,
now?
so I'm very grateful that I don't get those texts from Tom.
I try to stay spoiler free initially. It's mostly like all caps OMG or like heart emojis or something like that. So if you're reading Josh's text out of context, you might think that there's, something with us, but it's all about the Mandalorian.
This week I did get those kinds of OMG but spoiler-free texts from friend of the show and Legal Geek, Bethany.
Yes.
Yeah.
She was very excited about the guest that should be coming up sometime soon.
Yeah, she messaged me at work like around noon. She's like, "Have you seen it?" So again, it's just I know she wants for Christmas the Ahsoka lightsaber. So yeah, it's perfectly Santa's watching. So yeah, it's completely appropriate to want that for anyone who's an attorney. Like I ordered a Walmart wall mount for my office for my Galaxy's Edge lightsaber this week, so that will go up next week at work. So again, it's fun stuff.
Very nice.
Yeah, I felt it was a gift from another legal geek for my birthday last year in the before times, where I got to do the lightsaber build, and I thought, like, you know what, there's a nice space on the office wall where that could go up, and I'm sure there could be interesting discussions during the CMC or hearing at some
And then if anybody threatens you with or tries to assign you work that you don't want to do, you just, kind of motion toward the lightsaber and, that goes away.
Yeah.
You don't want a showdown.
I mean, it'd be neat if it floated over, but yeah, it'd be weird not to. So let's talk about this episode. And out of the gate, I loved it. Bryce Dallas Howard's directing skills have continued to grow, and she's clearly learned a lot from Dad, and she did a really nice job from a director perspective with it. So we begin with the Razor Crest having a rough landing because, they can't slow down. Controls are fried. He botches the landing right at the end because of an engine failure. And we do see, again, I have a lot of boating experience because I'm a volunteer in Sea Scouts. So, the last, 30 years of my life have been very nautical as a youth or as a volunteer. And seeing the Walker crane hoist extract the Razor's Crest, if you've gone through the Oakland estuary or parts of Long Beach have that, any place where we have a port of entry where we're getting imports from other countries, you see what look like Imperial Walkers that are big cranes for taking off cargo containers. So seeing them actually lean in and play with that, just from a sailor perspective, I thought that was cool. And that fishing village or whaling village looked like an industrial Mystic seaport. For those who haven't gone there, it's a vintage whaling town. It's very picturesque, so it's like full-on historical reenactments. And there was a lot of elements of fishing villages, whether it's like a feeling of Gloucester or Mystic, and they really leaned in to the foggy feeling, the big sweaters, and
I love the cable net for the Moncal worker.
Yeah,
this was Mon Calamari. Is that right?
No, Trask is the planet.
Thank you.
And we don't know. I don't know if I assume the planet is called Trask. What that city is called, we don't know. But if we think about the creativity of Star Wars naming conventions, it's probably like Trask Port or Trask City.
It's just the Mandalorian mentions right at the end, like, Mon Calamari or something as they're taking off. I assume he must be it must be just a reference as opposed to, gosh darn this particular planet.
Well, and the two aquatic species that are in that village are from Mon Calamari. So they're, like, we've seen them, there's a arc in Clone Wars with a young Akbar and installing the prince who's going to be the future ruler. And those species, those species appear in addition to a shark type one, and there's a giant Jaws homage.
It is good to see them played consistently as a-holes, because they were a-holes in the Clone Wars, and they haven't lost that touch here.
Nope, they are not fun people to be around. It's like, oh, these guys, it's a character trait of the entire species. Lovely.
I also wanted to mention, I really enjoyed, like, there was a little bit of a long build-up or a long wind-up at the beginning of this episode, but I really enjoyed it because they got to actually play around with and show what the, cantina and other environments would look like on a mostly water world populated by aquatic and amphibious species. It was kind of cool.
Yes, it was. So, again, and it looks like a fishing village, and it's all very nice. Chowder is the one thing that's served at that diner, and it looked like chowder. It's just it's very, very nautical. I can't help but wonder if the guys who work at Lucasfilm, came down from the Presidio and were like hitting skomas for lunch and just like going around Pier 39 and High Street Pier taking notes, going like, like,
my general rule of thumb is that I only eat at restaurants that serve food from a tube hanging in the ceiling. That's the measure of quality that I need to give my business to a place like that. But I in terms of like the legal issues, the thought that popped in my brain before he even got to this bar was the Razor Crest is beat up, like with a capital B in bold font. And I know having lived in a few different states, there are certain standards that you have to be able to operate a motor vehicle from place to place. And, my thought was immediately that he should be glad that the New Republic didn't have another run-in with him, because I think he'd be getting ticketed for having a non-space worthy vessel.
A couple
there.
taillights out, I think.
I'm reminded of the scene from Planes, Trains, and Automobiles with the burned out rental car with do you feel this is safe for highway driving? Well, yes, officer. Yeah, they're in that category of beat up. And it goes to the issue of repair, because we have the the mechanic, for lack of a better term, offer to, I'll do what I can. I can make it fly, or I'll fill it up. It will hold fuel. And first off, the voice was adorable. Secondly, that's there were no terms described of what I can do to fix it. So there was no true contract of going in. It's hey, I need to replace the brakes, or it need change the oil, or whatever. It's, you look at how beat up it is, and it's okay, what can you do? So there wasn't really an agreement in terms, and that's just something that stuck out to me, because it was a very undefined contract.
Could there be an argument from Mando that the terms were implicit? In other words, he wasn't expecting, a laundry list of specific items, but that the mechanic sees the shape that the ship is in. It's clearly got some, we'll call it hull integrity issues.
Yeah.
And, does he get to drop off the car or the crest as a non-expert in mechanics and whatnot, and just, hand the money over and trust that the terms are implied, that he, that mechanic should rank order what needs to be done and do what he can off that list? Is there any kind of implicit terms to that deal?
Nuri, what are your thoughts?
I was just going to add, and I was trying to look up to make sure I was, right, and I think I am. But in general, where there is, where a contract term would seem indefinite on its face, if there is a commonly accepted term, within, or a commonly accepted meaning for that otherwise facially indefinite term within a particular trade, courts will usually accept that as both parties probably, clearly meant to say this, even though they used a pretty vague term. So, we might be able to save the contract there with this one if, do what you can, or I can make it fly, generally have trade terms that people within that craft, that industry understand, then that would help. Otherwise, you do have a problem of an overly ambiguous contract. And in that case, since it's, oral, not written, you can't even construe it against the drafter.
And I would argue that if you go to the end of the episode, he did perform. Mando's issue was not with the amount of, items that he ticked off the list or lack thereof. It wasn't as though he just sort of slapped a piece of plywood on and took his 1,000 credits. He did a fair amount of work. It's just that the quality of that work and the materials used, not up to snuff. I mean, he's got rope and netting all over the place. It's a classic Mon Calamari repair job. And that's more what Mando took an issue with. And, at that point...
Oh, that is why he made that comment too. I get it.
Yeah, but then at that point, it's your argument is less about performance or failure of the contract and more about, if I'm the Mon Cal mechanic, I'm going to say it's going to fly. It's going to do exactly what I said. It's going to have, the warranty for, my craftsmanship, my workmanship here is still intact. Come back to me if one of these netting or panels blows off and you crash. But if I'm the Mon Cal, I'm standing by my work.
Yep, but the crest still is shedding skin as it takes off. Parts are still...
I thought that shot at the end was just so golden.
It's just
leaving behind a little piece.
It's just it just hurts from... Well, to my core, as somebody who likes airplanes, spaceships, and boats, it's just you want the boat to be watertight. Same with the spacecraft. You don't want a vacuum taking place because people get sucked out that way. It's not good. and just seeing it shedding parts, it's like, guys, that's rough. So yeah, I is the hull pressurized, or are they just stuck in the cockpit still? So there's some issues there that I think are noteworthy.
Even if it's pressurized, another question: do you trust it to stay pressurized?
Yeah, would you fly back there?
Yeah.
Yeah, the problem is the only bathroom on that ship is in the compartment that is or isn't pressurized. So that's going to create a practical issue pretty quick. Maybe not for Baby Yoda, but Mando's going to have some tough decisions to make.
Yeah, and how long is the flight to the next planet to try to find Ahsoka?
Although, at least since they're back to light speed, hopefully not too long, at least until they can get to a better mechanic.
Yeah.
Because that does seem to be one of the issues here, is like, there's not a repeat transaction that's about to happen with that mechanic. I think the incentive to show some good craftsmanship outside of the strict terms of the contract, as Tom pointed out, were diminished.
Yeah, and it's like almost go back to Tatooine, because that will get done correctly there by Amy Sedaris. So, anywho, let's talk about the restaurant. And seafood restaurants can have a lobster tank, and you pick out the lobster that looks mean, that you figure, I want that one, and I want his friends to watch. Like, you can do that and be that sadistic, or same with crabs. It's like that one. And you hear dead lobster walking, and your dinner's made. We have food safety standards. So it's one thing to have sushi, and there are rules with sushi. Like, you don't get sushi from a truck stop. But
you should not get
you can.
From a truck stop.
It's not a
you can, but
it's not a good life choice. Live food that you either have to ingest live or kill is not something we normally see in Western culture. That just doesn't happen. And it immediately made me think of food safety standards. Now, we have some FDA food safety guidelines that are on the FDA website. And Nari, since you did have an experience in food service in your youth, can you help us understand what those requirements are?
Yeah, so I don't know, Tom, if you had a similar experience working in food service as a young person, but I had to get a food handler's card when I was growing up in Arizona in order to work at Starbucks, actually. Even though they don't serve, freshly prepared food, you still had to get the basic license because, you handle food. You have to manage a refrigerator and things like that. And like the rules are pretty basic. So some of them include and this is FDA standards, but it all sounds, pretty similar to what I had to memorize. Washing your hands and cooking tools, very important. Washing the food, rinsing fruits and vegetables. Some of the ones that are a little bit less intuitive, perhaps, that, you maybe don't, like the things I just mentioned, everyone should be practicing at home. The second one that maybe people don't understand is also how you store different types of food in a refrigerator. If you haven't seen, I think it's Kitchen Nightmares. There's a lot of these in there where, they go into the fridge and they see the raw meat being stored on the top shelf, right? And then all of the vegetables being stored right underneath it, or even a dessert being stored right underneath it. And the point about that is just, in the event that there are drippings off of the raw meat and they do not get secured by whatever package it's in, you want to make sure it has nowhere to go, right? Because you might be serving some of those vegetables raw. You don't want anything prepared that's ready to eat right underneath it either, because anything that touches raw meat either needs to be cleaned thoroughly or cooked thoroughly. So that's why you generally store it in the bottom shelf. Other things I had to memorize that are also in the FDA guidelines are the safe temperatures at which you can cook meat. I will say, though, that as a home cook, I generally find those temperatures to be a little bit high for people that don't prefer their meat to be kind of
roasted,
dry. But nonetheless, those are the safe temperatures in the sense that, that's the temperature you get to where the chance of you getting a foodborne illness are basically negligible. Most people will accept a small amount of risk in order to, for example, have a rare steak.
I'm glad to hear that Arizona has some, standards like that. North Carolina, it was like the Wild West. And not that there weren't rules and whatnot, but I didn't have to get a license when I worked at Buffalo Wild Wings. So, you were assuming the risk. We'll use the legal term when you walked into my section there, even though I wasn't cooking the food. But it all goes back to sort of a liability premise, right? It's one thing if like you, me, or Josh are cooking at home and you just ignore rules like that and you get sick, that's your own fault. But when we go out to a restaurant and we're sort of putting our trust into somebody else and we're paying them to prepare food, we expect it to be done in a way that's not going to send us like to the toilet all night or to the hospital in a worst case scenario. And so it becomes a liability issue for a restaurant to meet these standards. Like one thing that we did have when I worked at, Buffalo Wild Wings and also at Subway, was random inspections from the state. And so a health inspector would come in and, you always see the little grade from the Department of Health at most restaurants, like an A, B, C, D grade. And those random inspections would set that grade, and they're looking at everything top to bottom. And, it's a set of public health rules that holds those restaurants' feet to the fire to make sure that they're doing those things. And, if you did a scheduled inspection, if you knew it was coming, everything would be tip top. The idea is you want to catch a restaurant operating like they normally do, not operating on their best behavior. And I don't know that this restaurant or this bar here on Trask has any kind. I would be surprised if it was above a C grade in terms of what we saw swimming around in Baby Yoda's food and just the general. I just like the tube that he had to pull down to dispense this chowder from. It just looks really sanitary. So,
yeah, ironically, I like the ambiance, but then again, I'm kind of nautically inclined. So I look at it, it's like, oh, this is classic New England, tavern for sailors and whalers, and it's like yar, like for me, it's like that. I would enjoy some time there. Maybe not the menu. I don't like seafood. Yeah.
And not going to attract a lot of tourists, so it'll get your business, but not mine.
I got the place all to myself.
Yeah. Food from a tube. It's like, so you want the chowder, or do you want the beef stroganoff? Does that come from a tube? Like, how does this work? So there's definitely, again, I like the ambiance. So I'll just leave it at that. Now we meet what can be described as a commercial fisherman. So I don't know if they were watching Deadliest Catch or if they had Moby Dick recently on. I don't know the inspiration. But we were on a boat that's supposed to be a couple hour sail to go find other Mandalorians. And just, again, speaking sailor, like all the dock lines that they have, the netting, all of that makes sense from a nautical perspective to me. Like it looks familiar that they clearly hung out and were looking at the fishing fleet around Pier 39. Like they came down the hill from the Presidio, and that's where they hung out and they had lunch one day, and they took really copious notes. Good job, guys. Love what you're doing. What doesn't make sense is what looks like the giant sail at the bow of the boat. It's like, what's the purpose of that? Because it doesn't. What's it do? Because that seems like an obstruction. It would make sense if it's a mast with lights for, say, towing, but like that's not its function. It doesn't make sense to me. We do see davits and cranes. All that makes sense. And what would be like the cargo hold, like the fish hold, where they'd be dumping fish and dumping live fish. All of that makes sense. And what doesn't make sense is the creature that they have living in there that they're apparently fishing for to feed. Why do that? Is that thing going to get butchered at some point. So this is a weird.
Yeah, I assume it has to either be a food thing or it's a like exotic creature that sells for a lot, like a sarlacc or something like that. You know, maybe there's a Hutt somewhere who wants to keep that in his lair.
Yeah, and at the post credits where they were showing the art, one of them of the fishing village looks like they're butchering what would have been a whale, you know, or at least conceptually what we would have seen 150 years ago, because that's what people did when they hunted whales. We don't have anything that big that comes out of the ocean anymore because we don't hunt whales unless you're a Japanese research vessel or yeah. So anyway, that's another topic entirely. But
I wonder if they keep it there, if it reproduces and like the offspring or like the young are something that they can then sell. You know, like it's like a chicken that lays eggs. And I say that because Sasha Banks' character, one of the other Mandalorians, who's named Casca Reeves in the episode, they're all kind of meeting and talking. You see her kind of slurp in a tentacle of something. And I just thought, you know, maybe that's something that they're doing there. Otherwise, they're just having a boat with a big carnivorous creature and they spend their days feeding it and then go back and who knows how they make money.
I think that might make a lot of sense. Because we do, like, there's also the tentacled live creature in Baby Yoda's food, right? Where do they get those? Maybe they are hatching out of the Mammacore.
Maybe. It's just, you look at that and it's like, okay, why? It's not, I don't see anyone milking that, at least in living, because that's good luck finding the other. So
dive on in.
It's like, no, I'm out. So anyway, just again, that's just a practical discussion of why, because like it doesn't make sense. It just exists. It's like the trash compactor monster. It's like, why was that there? How did that happen? But we have fishermen and sailors get a really bad name quickly in this. So they go from just being like a gruff fisherman that you kind of expect to attempted murder, that they just wanted to kill the kid and then kill Mando so they could get the Beskar and sell it. And Nari, could you walk us through attempted murder?
Sure. So attempted murder is all the same elements as murder, except of course you do not get to completion, which is the person is dead. Elements of murder include, number one, you have to have had intent to kill. If we're talking about first degree murder, it has to be premeditated. This one seems pretty premeditated. So I'm going to say check. The second one is you had to have taken some meaningful act in the furtherance of that intent to kill. And in this case, you know, they definitely did. They got him in the tank, I guess you would call it, the cage with the Mammacore, and they were trying to stab him or get him to drown, whatever that was, with the poles or the spears. I'm going to say that this all fits.
And with attempted murder, you really need intent, and that's there. Like they had intent.
I'm sorry, there was no plausible world in which this was not intentional. Like, are you going to say, oh, we accidentally got Baby Yoda in there and then accidentally tried to hit you with our
It's a slippery boat deck.
Yeah. Whoa.
Yeah.
Whoa.
Don't worry that the pram floats.
Yeah, there's a... go on, Thomas.
No, I was just going to say on the premeditation front, my typical MO is to watch the episode a second time through with subtitles on. And there's a brief bit right in the bar where the bartender goes over to the Quarren to basically tell him, you know, hey, these are the guys that can take you to the Mandalorians. And he whispers, it's hard to hear it if you don't have subtitles on, but the bartender tells him that, yeah, he's got Beskar on. So it's clear that, and they make that clear after they knock him in, that, hey, the Beskar is ours. That's what they're after. And so I think without a question, you can have premeditation with like 1 second of planning. It doesn't take a long scheme to check the intent box off. But I think very clearly they had this worked out from the get-go. Why Din didn't figure out that these guys were nefarious, I don't know. But that's another issue. And I also, it's interesting because they don't. It's not as if somebody pulls a blaster on Din and the child, and the traditional way of murder where one person kills another or tries to. Here, you're using like a creature to do that, and I think it still meets the elements there. If you were to like knock somebody into, like, you're walking around the zoo having a nice day and you shove somebody over into the tiger enclosure with the intent that the tiger eats them, that's murder. Just because you didn't do the biting or the eating, it doesn't make a big difference here. So
my husband died of natural causes. You pushed him off a cliff. Gravity is natural.
Yeah, it's like the the enemies of Putin who die of a bear attack in their apartment. It's the bear was in the apartment. How'd that happen? Like, it's that sort of
things happen in Russia.
Yeah. Pack of wild dogs in his apartment. What? Yeah. So we're in there. And now some of you might be wondering, well, how often does like situations come up where commercial boaters try murdering people? Well, there's case law. And it's apparently more frequent than we want to talk about. But one case it started in Colombia with the intent to sneak Cuban nationals into the United States. And what happened to the people who paid money was out of the 3 people, 2 were murdered, 2 of them were sexually assaulted, and the 3rd survived. So all bad. And that really just gives sailors a bad name for something of that magnitude to be happening. Now, we have the issue, I'm not sure who put it in, but we have the issue of intentional infliction of emotional distress, which
I put that one in.
On the entire audience, is that the victim of this?
Yeah. So assuming nothing else had happened, right? Well, actually, you would bring all the charges that you could, I think, if you were the prosecutor. And the part where they toss the child into the Mammacore tank, who is then, it appears like that at least his crib is like swallowed by the Mammacore, that is like a pretty classic case of intentional infliction of emotional distress. It's a family member, right? So we would definitely consider the Mandalorian and Baby Yoda to have this special relationship, which is one of the elements that you need for IIED. And they do this thing, which is, it either appears to or does, in fact, inflict grievous bodily harm or death in the presence of, the person who has the special relationship. This would be like, for example, and it's actually a little bit harder to get IIED than I think some people who first hear the term think, but this would be like, a father standing outside his house and somebody comes over and intentionally, right, like, runs a car over his kid. Like, that's IIED. And this would be exactly, I think, that textbook case.
Yes, absolutely. And yeah, good way to freak out the audience as well with like you.
Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
It's like you did what to the kid?
Yeah, I even though that they're not going to kill him in the scene, like, that with certainty, I still leaned forward and was like biting, down on something because I was so nervous about what might happen. And honestly, it was like to see him come back out of the water and the pram be so damaged and basically non-functional, have its door ripped off. That was rough too, just as an audience member. If Mando was going to sue like in civil court for this sort of thing, the first question I would ask him is, well, what if I'm thinking about representing him, is what kind of damages are we talking about? Because it's not enough, I should say, to go through the expense and time of litigation if your damages are just, well, that was an upsetting thing to see, and there are no other, damages that flowed from that. But I think between the damaged pram, which is clearly a valuable asset that's been destroyed because of this act, and if Mando has trouble like doing things, like, for example, your inability to work, so lost wages, is frequently a key element of damages in a civil case like this. So if Mando found himself just continually troubled by like say the memory of this event, and he can't take jobs, he's not able to function, he's got say diagnosable illnesses like PTSD or something like that flow, and he can show there's causation there, then he's got more of a case. If he walks into my office and the only thing is, hey, they destroyed my baby's pram, even if it's an expensive one, I'd say, well, that's tough. Maybe if you have a case for a small claims court, or that's fit for a small claims court, maybe, but it's hard to bring an entire lawsuit over something like that if you don't have more.
Agreed. And they, after, again, the rescue, and we'll talk about that next, the other Mandalorians destroy the vessel. So anything that could have been of salvage,
great scene, by the way,
salvage value, and it's like, so the thing that the assets destroyed. So,
like the sail on the front.
Yeah, well, again, I don't either.
That's why they blew it up. Let's get rid of this pointless ship.
Terrible ship. Goodbye.
So it doesn't make sense from a design aspect, and there's this giant killing thing in the cargo hold. Yeah, it has to die. We're killing it right now. I could see why they would scuttle her. Well, let's talk about the scene I did not see coming. So, like, normally I'm pretty good at predicting, but this was a very pleasant surprise with who we saw. And as soon as the uniforms appeared or the armors appeared, it's like, we're going to get to see her. This is cool. And it raises the wonderful issue of defense of others. That happens both on the boat and on the docks. And the analysis is simultaneous. And the defense of others, I'll just run quickly through the elements here and we can then analyze it. But the law for defense of others, or defense of oneself, requires that someone must actually and reasonably believe in the necessity of defending oneself from imminent danger of death or great bodily harm. And Nari, why don't you take the boat and in that analysis and applying these factors?
Sure. Okay, so when it comes to the Mandalorians showing up, do you mean like destroying the boat, or do you mean like killing the would-be murderer sailor?
Yeah, it's saving Mando and Child from.
Oh, okay. Because I was like, I don't know about destroying the boat. I don't know how that fits in here.
That was just a funny scene.
Yeah, that's just being punitive. Of we never want anyone to do this again. Sending a message.
So I think that this probably, so it's not oneself is the thing, but you usually can do defense of others when it comes to self-defense. And I believe that would definitely qualify here. You have, even if they didn't see Baby Yoda getting tossed in, they have Mando clinging to the bars and they're trying to stab him or push him down into the monster. That's imminent danger of death or great bodily injury. That qualifies. Showing up and then using deadly force also probably qualifies, especially in this instance where it seems like they have a pattern of practice of killing Mandalorians.
Yeah,
that armor has to be really heavy. You see him. I think you're spot on about the threat to him, because even though he's got a grip somewhat on the grates that are above him, if you look, he's firing his rocket pack just to stay up. So it gives you a sense of how much of a struggle it is. And he's not doing that because he's being, stabbed at. It's because the armor is literally dragging him down. So I think you're exactly right. He was going to die if they didn't intervene.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. And it was neat seeing them kick ass. That was just so much fun. What's things that we had only seen in animation happen on live screen. It's like, nice. That made my day.
What I love about it is, like, Mando is good, but he's got his limitations, right? He's not always, he's not like a Jedi where it's just any foe that comes up against him, he's just slicing through like hot butter. But when Bo-Katan and her team arrive, they are like a surgical force. I mean, it's and if you know Bo-Katan's history, if you've watched the Clone Wars or Rebels, you know how much history. I mean, her entire life has been fighting and combat and whatnot. So you're watching this well-oiled Mandalorian machine in action. That was awesome to see.
Exactly. Plus, the actress playing her has no shortage of live action experience playing a fighter. And if you watch Katie Sarkoff's Instagram, it's like there are the workout videos and everything that she does. It's like awesome. Just awesome to see. Which then brings us to the second part of, we have the fight on the dock. And Thomas, again, similar analysis here of, we have angry fishermen saying, "You killed my brother." And again, Bo-Katan and company arrive and eliminate the threat. Analysis, please.
This one has a slight wrinkle to it in that, the Quarren, had they not all been shot dead, might argue that, they were somehow, their use of force was somehow connected to or justified because of the Mandalorian's use of force. That, in other words, he started this, he killed my brother, we're doing this. But, there's enough time in between those acts. It's not as if this Quarren little posse showed up right as the fight was happening on the boat. This is like hours later in a different location. This is a revenge killing, right? They're finishing what the other family member started. And so that's not a justification for the Quarren. Good thing for Bo-Katan, she steps in right during the exact same sort of moment that she did on the boat, which is this moment where he's about to get shot. It's clear that he's facing death or grievous bodily harm. And the whole, the thing with self-defense, the question that you have to ask is, if Bo-Katan steps into his shoes, into Mando's shoes, what sort of force would she be able to use? Because that's the central question for self-defense. And in that case, she'd be able to respond to that deadly threat with deadly force. So that's why she and her comrades there are able to shoot him up there and save Mando once again.
If I could just add one thing, I just want to emphasize. So when Tom, you were talking about whether or not they're justified based on what happened on the fishing boat or the Mamacor boat, whatever it was. There's a big thing. So we're assuming that none of these Quarrens are law enforcement authorities. So generally when we're talking about private use of force, we're talking about, preventing grievous bodily harm or death to yourself or someone else. If the person is already dead, right? If someone had been threatening grievous bodily harm, and now that person, the victim, is already dead, you do not have then the justification that you would have had when that person was being threatened but still alive. So you can't, and that's like the distinction here, right? We don't recognize a private right of force when it comes to revenge. That is what we leave to the authorities. The only thing that you could then maybe insert there is like a citizen's arrest. But in that case also, you have to have personally witnessed the felony. They are obviously not on the boat. Someone told them. I guess I saw the boat blow up. It was probably the Mandalorian. And, in most jurisdictions, you have to have personally witnessed the crime. And it has to be like immediate. You can't then wait around for him to get back to the dock and be like, yeah, let's go arrest him now. And even then, your use of deadly force is going to be extremely prescribed. So I don't think that there's any legal justification for this brawl.
No, it's a revenge killing. He wanted revenge. And again, rough sailor at the dock. It's a tale as old as time. But no. Now we
there's no Batman defense.
Yeah.
Unfortunately.
Well, handy, not legal. Which brings us to, again, we're back to the bar. Hopefully a different bar. Because if they already tried murdering you once, don't go back. So there's that. And we have a heist planned to raid Imperials. And Thomas, this I think is going to really go to your experience with Law of War as a JAG officer, but we have the let's get into the legality of Mandalorians raiding an Imperial transport. And these were my thoughts, and to help frame the issue. Mandalorians have been butchered by the Empire. We have someone who was the rightful head of state that was either deposed, or there are facts that we don't know that transpired after Rebels. However, the Battle of Jakku has taken place. The Empire has surrendered, but there's still an Imperial fleet running around under Moff Gideon. How big is it? What are their resources? How are they able to still afford paying the troops that work for them? Are they... I would think they're operating more than just plundering a planet in order for its resources. There has to be a functional society with taxes that go to support the operation, so that way they're actually like self-sustaining, as opposed to like former Confederates on the run, or the werewolves after the end of World War II in Germany. The guys were putting piano wire up between trees to decapitate soldiers. Like, this isn't a hit and run operation. They're trying to have a functional government still. And all of that's bad. So is there a state of war between Mandalore and that Imperial remnant? Or is there some other legal basis that the Mandalorians could actually plan a raid on Imperials? Or is this just pure piracy? And Tom, your thoughts?
I'm just going to play with my little toy Gozanti cruiser here.
Okay.
Now that's been gloriously on screen again. The question of a state of war is an interesting one. I would look at it as
engage in war. Do they have a nation state?
Well, that's a great question. That's exactly where I was going, and I would ask the same question about the Empire. At this point, they have signed the Galactic Concordance, which is the instrument with the New Republic that required them to surrender, and the core term of that document was that the Empire, as we know it, or as we knew it, is gone. There is an empire like little e, but they're confined to a really small space within, I think, the core sector of the galaxy. But they're roped off, and any other Imperials that are still operating who don't then surrender are considered war criminals. So those folks might think that they have, in terms of the Imperials, like Gideon and the captain of this cruiser, might think that they have authority and that their nation state still exists. The same way like the Taliban or ISIS might think that they have a nation state because they say they do, and they make a flag and uniforms and stuff like that. But it doesn't actually, like, saying that and doing those things doesn't actually give you authority. And I think there's a little more complex argument for the Mandalorians because they, at least where we saw them at the end of Rebels, the animated show, they had united, that these disparate families and tribes had united under under Bo-Katan. She had the Darksaber, this cultural piece of property that is this great unifier, sort of like Excalibur. And, I think you can infer that, and they had gotten out from, at least temporarily, the Empire's boot heel. And so you could infer that the mantle that Bo-Katan took was the same one that her sister held, the rightful ruler of Mandalore, and, a planet that was a nation state. After that, the Great Purge happens. She clearly gets run off into exile somehow. And, does the government, does her legitimacy just cease to exist? I tend to think not. And so if she's acting as part statesman, part, commander-in-chief of what remains of Mandalore's forces and that sort of thing, I think there is some level of authority there for her to go after remaining Imperial forces. And I think from the New Republic standpoint, I don't know if they would condone that sort of thing because they want to end war and violence, but I think they wouldn't necessarily expend a lot of effort to stop the Mandalorians because they're, you know, they're pursuing violence for, you know, the common good, for lack of a better term. So I think they would look the other way.
Well, so
I don't know. That was a lot of words for.
I have one more question, sort of building off of that. And this is partly a question just stemming from a little bit of my lack of knowledge about Clone Wars and Rebels and things like that. My understanding of the state of the universe or the galaxy at the time of this episode is that the Mandalorians do not hold territory. Is that correct?
So it doesn't sound like they hold Mandalore based on what Bo-Katan said. They were driven from it, and it was an interesting dichotomy because Din says, "Well, that place is cursed. You know, anybody who goes there dies." And Bo-Katan doesn't really come out and say all the details, but she's like, "Don't believe everything you've heard." So it sounds to me like there's some remnant that still exists there. That it's, you know. There might be Mandalorians there, but she's rallying forces to try to take it back.
Just because, like, and you're welcome to correct me if I'm wrong, Tom, but one of my understandings about sovereignty and whether or not you're a nation state is that, and this might be a little counterintuitive, or at least not intuitive for some listeners, is that generally speaking, in order to be considered a sovereign nation, you have to have territory. And this would be why, like you were just saying, you know, if ISIS holds no territory, we don't recognize them as a nation state. It's also slightly less darkly, maybe actually differently darkly. It's one of the reasons why there are Pacific Island nation states that are actually in danger of no longer becoming nation states as a result of rising ocean levels because of climate change. And there was an interesting, you know, little legalistic discussion about whether or not you could relocate some of those nation states to places that were offering land, like Australia or New Zealand, but whether they would actually still exist as a nation state if, you know, if those countries that were offering to host them didn't literally cede the territory, right? Because then you have a culture that's living within another nation state, but they don't technically hold territory. So it's just kind of an interesting thing. And I think in order to be in a state of war, as opposed to just being a non-state actor like a terrorist group engaging in hostilities, you would have to have some kind of sovereign nation state with territory.
I would almost, those are really, really good points. And the thought that popped into my head as you were talking would be some of the European nations that were overrun by the Blitzkrieg in World War II. So the Nazis sweep in and say, like a country like Poland, you know, the Nazis control the territory. I think there are some differences here because there still was, you know, some form of government. I don't think the Nazis just replaced everybody with German folks, you know, running the government. But those countries didn't cease to exist, you know, afterward. And certainly there was a resistance movement within a lot of those nations. And when all was said and done and the Nazis were beaten back, you know, those nations didn't cease to exist. And if I'm Bo-Katan, I would say, look, the only reason that we don't control territory here is because you guys carried out a genocide against our people. Well, you didn't do a good enough job, and we're still here, so we're going to fight back and take our planet back.
Oh yeah, and I don't mean to, but with that discussion, I don't mean to say that I don't fully support.
Oh no,
empire. You know, even if you don't have a nation state at the moment, it's just, you know, in discussing law of war, and for example, you know, would they be entitled to combatants privilege and stuff like that? You know, from the empire's perspective, they might not be because their nation may be surrendered or doesn't exist. And so, like, again, I don't mean to say that I think they're the bad guys. The resistance in France and everything are definitely the good guys. It's just this kind of, you know, highly formalistic law of war that invokes certain privileges that even, you know, countries or nations or empires that we consider to be morally bad generally observed as neutral principles of war. But anyway.
Yeah. No, it's fascinating because it seems like this very Star Wars thing that's happened to the Mandalorians, but it's happened. I mean, it's just a callback to repeated events in history. You know, unfortunately so. You're on mute, Josh.
And Josh, I see that you added something to our notes about this. Would you like to talk about that for a second?
Yeah, I will. So with the idea of like part of Australia getting ceded to a Pacific Island nation that's losing its islands, I learned way back in law school doing a research project that Native Americans are their nations are viewed as dependent sovereign nations to the United States, which seems like a massive contradiction in terms to have a dependent sovereign nation within another country. But maybe something like that could be the solution that would be, to help those that are literally losing the land that they live on. Now, thinking back to...
I just wanted to say, like, that's definitely a good point. And I think, though, it's interesting also, though, to illustrate that while, those kinds of different autonomous areas or sovereign, different forms of sovereignty can be meaningful and have significance for all kinds of other reasons. One thing that, being from Arizona, there's like a number of large Native American reservations in Arizona, including Navajo and Apache. They get to do a lot of their own thing. They have their own court system, all of this stuff. One thing they can't do is declare war. Yeah,
because that could get awkward fast. Very fast. But they're also U.S. citizens. So again, so again, there's a reason why Arizona went blue. So let's get into. I think part of this issue is thinking back to Rebels. Mandalore Prime wasn't the only territory that Mandalore held. There were other planets and moons where we had Mandalorians living, other clans, other families. So that doesn't mean that those were all wiped out. So they, let's just say that the lower 48 take a massive hit of some kind. The United States still doesn't mean that we don't exist, because we still have Alaska, Hawaii, Puerto Rico, the Virgin Islands. There's still parts of us left. And so again, it's a very interesting thing to consider. I'll toss out that just finally with piracy, because the Imperials referred to the Mandalorians as pirates. And the legal definition of piracy from the Convention on the High Seas is piracy is any illegal acts of violence, detention, or act of depredation committed for private ends by the crew or the passengers of a private ship or private aircraft and directed. Well, I don't know if they fully meet the definition, because the point is for Bo-Katan to build up her forces to retake Mandalore. So it's not necessarily a private end of what they're trying to pull off.
Well, she does want to be the Mandalore. That could be a private end.
Yeah,
it makes sense that they would tag him with that status, though, because traditionally and historically, the protections that you have to give to somebody that you're fighting that's a pirate, and your ability to use force against a pirate is very, very different than, say, another. If they were recognizing them as Mandalorians, like in other words, like representatives of Mandalore, a sovereign nation. So that's very convenient for the Empire to declare them that, because it sort of allows them to go gloves off and not have to play by too many rules.
Yeah. And yeah, it's a very interesting legal conundrum, because it's not straight analysis because of the status of the participants in the fight. It's like, because those Imperials are still acting like there's an empire. It's very weird. They're not acting like a defeated nation that surrendered. So now we do have a wonderful partial callback to the Empire Strikes Back, and that's the glory of I'm altering. I'm altering the deal.
Pray that I do not alter it further.
Can I just say that Din needs to invest some of his credits in like a general counsel?
Yeah.
Because again and again, you think Lando had it bad on Cloud City, but again and again, he finds himself having struck deals, negotiated at arm's length with the other party, and then the rug just gets pulled out from under him. And, he's just having to bite down. He needs a good attorney on his side to be able to clean this stuff up, fire some angry letters off. And
then he would also need a court and a judge, and then they would also need to have a bailiff and a marshal. There's a lot of work to be done here.
Details.
But yeah, this is definitely another really fun example of how not to do contract modification.
Oh God, yes.
And I think we discussed contract modification in an earlier episode. I think it was the one before, right? With Fish Lady. In a way that was good, in the sense that the best way and the most sure way to have a validly modified contract is for both parties to consent, right?
Mm-hmm.
In this case, technically you could argue that Mando agreed to it. There's a problem here, though, which is that you can't modify a contract under duress. I think most people think of that as the classic example with Vader, right? Duress meaning threat of bodily harm or death. That doesn't necessarily have to be true. The classic case involving this is actually appropriately another fisherman's case. It's Alaska Packers Association versus Domenico. Yeah, in which there were a group of Alaskan fishermen that decided to, in the middle of a haul, basically say that you need to raise what you're paying us, or we're not going to bring this in. The person who owned the fishing trawler and had hired them, of course, is now left in a lurch. He's not in any physical threat of danger or violence, but he had invested quite a bit in this boat and taking this out. And this is like a once in a year season, right, where you take this haul. If he doesn't get these fish back, or these crabs, whatever it was, sorry, I forget the details, but the haul back, he's going under, right? So and that was a situation of duress, even though it was economic. And so when they get, he agrees to it because he has to. He needs them to finish the season and bring in the haul. But when they get back and are like, okay, so give us our increased wages, he says, hell no, because they're not going to be able to enforce that modification in court. And in fact, they could not.
Yeah, rightly so, because it's a jerk move to try to do that in the middle of performance. Well, we have Bo-Katan does this with, we're going to go from just taking the weapons to we're taking the ship. And then I don't know how much of that was a command decision just at that moment with hey, we need to go for the entire ship, or if she had that plan from the get-go and didn't disclose.
Pretty premeditated to me.
I don't think she disclosed that term intentionally.
Yeah, I want to give her the benefit of the doubt, but maybe I just have a soft spot for redheads. I don't know. I want to believe it was I just changed my mind because I'm used to being in charge. I get that, but Mando going whoa, time out. I'm done. I did my part. Yeah, it's
info now, please.
Yeah, it's highly problematic. Just from I didn't sign on to capture the ship, even though they did it pretty effectively in cutting through the Imperials. So with just
that was close pulling that ship up. That was not a foregone conclusion.
No, but they did cut through the Imperials pretty quickly, and we do learn that Moff Gideon's pretty cold and calculated. On one level, you got to appreciate the professionalism of the Imperial captain calling in and saying, hey, we need reinforcements. And Gideon asking for specific details, saying, it's too late. Sorry. Maybe if you called 10 minutes ago, we could have done something, but not now. You lost. And he then shoots his pilots and going to do a suicide maneuver. That's commitment to long live the Empire. But it's not.
They must have good pensions. That's all I'm saying.
The fact that it was so cold, it wasn't fanatical type behavior. There was no yelling or anything like that. It's actually fairly terrifying because it's cold, calculated, and he had no problem doing it. Moreover, there was a fear of death from Gideon if he had survived. So it highlights the Imperial handbook of we just kill people left and right in order to determine loyalty.
It reminded me of Hydra out of the MCU, just the way in which they operate. But it's fascinating to see the Empire turn into or turn to the Rebel Alliance's original way of operating. Which, well, I'm not saying that they would ever like crash a ship to prevent any leaks, but the idea here is there is no giant Imperial Navy anymore. Information is valuable and their network is valuable. So the moment that the network is threatened, you've got to cut off a cell. And that's exactly what was happening here.
And I have a question for you, Tom. Is there anything in the law of war or the Uniform Code of Justice that would allow you to kill your pilots?
That's not really a gray area. I would say no.
Yeah, I thought so. Yeah, I can't think of anything in the Uniform Code either.
I did the seeing, and I think this is the first time we've seen it on screen. But like the Star Wars equivalent of a cyanide cap tooth or a cyanide pill that you carry, although the electrocution seemed a little rougher than just being poisoned. But
yeah, it's a hard way to go out.
I don't think he cared about whatever potential charges were going to follow.
No, it's. I believe from prior discussions, didn't you say that like a quarter of the Imperial fleet had been not accounted for after Jakku?
Mm-hmm.
So there's
yeah.
That's still huge. That's a huge number. So again, what does Gideon control? Are we talking like a couple Star Destroyers? Or are we talking what looks like the 7th Fleet? Like, what are we dealing with here? Like, how armed are they? What resources do they have? And how are they self-sustaining? Because you just...
Starforge is my guess.
Yeah.
Sorry.
You got to be able to feed people. You got to be able to pay people. Because if you don't do that, just hoping that the soldiers stay around out of loyalty isn't going to fly, because they're going to get hungry and leave. And it was the same issue that we had after the fall of the Soviet Union. The fear of some guy sitting in a missile silo selling the nuclear weapon for a ton of money because he's not getting paid. This doesn't seem to be a problem with the Imperials, because they have to be stable, which means their paychecks and food, and that they're living comfortably. So again, maybe they'll explore that more. I don't know. I'll throw out quickly, again, being nautical. There's something known as wake damage. As a boat moves through the water, it creates wake. It's displacement. And it's why you've seen with the littoral ships that are on their trimarans, that's supposed to help minimize the wake. Or like if it's on a hydrofoil, it's supposed to minimize the wake because there's less of it going through the water. Because that's a problem with a stealth ship. If you can see the rooster tail, it's not stealth. So again, it might not be coming up on radar, but you can see it visually with satellites or aircraft and all that good stuff. Well, you're responsible for your wake. And if you've ever gone boating in the California Delta, there are all these no-wake zones, because if you go through there casting a wake and you damage docks, you're responsible for it. And so this comes from this provision in Admiralty law that it is well established that if the wake generated by a passing ship damages a docked vessel, the moving vessel is presumed to be at fault. Well, we have a lot of low flying over water throwing out a hell of a lot of wake that has to do damage, because there had to be a reason for them to have that low speed ascent, so they were not causing wake damage. And I just find that fascinating. They actually thought about it. They might not have fully understood why, but they did hit on a legal doctrine, even if they didn't understand it. And
what was especially interesting, because that's fascinating. I learned something in this podcast. But they were adhering to the rules. This wasn't like your classic Imperials, like we do what we want, we'll smash and grab. And they only violated the rules when it became clear that they needed to get out of there and try to turn the tables on the Mandalorians. And so it almost, like canonically, I thought about it, and this is a black market port and a black market planet. There are probably few places that the surviving Imperials can go and get the things that they need to get. So it behooves them to not just not destroy the place that they need to rely on, but they want to be welcomed back. And the quickest way to be banished from, the black market port that you need is to destroy everything with your cruiser's wake.
Yeah, because there's no repeat business. And it also still highlights the black market port still had rules based on common sense. It's like, we like living here too, guys. So we want...
Well, it's like the mob has bookkeepers. Like, it turns out that to get large groups of people to operate and do anything, you need organization, you need rules, and you need books.
Look, you can contract for murder and trade in illegal weapons all you want, but do not accelerate in the no wake zone. You will be banished.
It's like the weird libertarian society. It's like you can do X, Y, and Z, but you will not mess up the roads. No. 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 That was just wonderful to see. And I don't know if the writers actually realized what they were doing when they put that in, but it's glorious. Now let's get to a meat and potato issue, and it's full nerd love. And Thomas, you might want to take the laboring oar with some of the facts with this. But who owns the Darksaber? So it's in the possession of Moff Gideon. We first see it in Clone Wars. We then see Maul defeat, was it Gar Saxon? Am I remembering that?
Yes.
Okay.
Yep.
I can play trivia too.
Impressive.
And we have Sabine Wren, who recovers it in Rebels when they're on Maul's homeworld. And she eventually gives it to Bo-Katan for Bo-Katan to try to unite all the houses of Mandalore. We don't know and that's during the Galactic Civil War. We don't know what happens afterwards. So we don't know what happened during the Night of a Thousand Tears. We don't know how Bo-Katan loses it and how Moff Gideon gains it. But what are your, let's get into the thoughts of who's technically the legal owner of it. And Tom, did I miss any facts?
No, that was a great, I don't want to face off against you in Darksaber trivia now. The original, the origin of this weapon is it's a lightsaber that's crafted, or a pseudo lightsaber that's crafted by the first Mandalorian Jedi. He then passes away. There's Tar Vizsla, and the Jedi keep the weapon at the temple, much to the consternation of the Mandalorians, because this is an important artifact. At some point, I think Death Watch, or that larger collective, takes it, and then it sort of stays in Mandalorian hands until Moff Gideon Darth Maul briefly has it, as you mentioned. So I look at it as like an important piece of cultural property, and I think we talked about this an episode or two ago, and it sounds like Moff Gideon got his hands on it during the Great Purge, or the Night of a Thousand Tears, which we don't know what happened, but I'm guessing at least 1,000 tears, if not more, were shed during that, whatever happened there. So it's like, I look at it as he's a soldier. This was a military operation, and he took a piece of cultural property off the battlefield that did not belong to him. And so I see it in the same vein as if, an Allied soldier went into one of, Saddam's palaces, or, go back to World War II and went into one of Hitler's, houses or something like that, and took something that didn't belong to them. The question of original ownership is almost like secondary. Just because it was stolen and you happen to also steal it doesn't negate liability for you. But the general rule of thumb is you can't steal stuff off the battlefield. There's no spoils of war is not a legal defense. And so that's exactly what I think Moff Gideon sees this thing as. And I don't think he has any rightful claim to it.
So I just want to add, I totally agree with that from the perspective of the cultural artifact and law, international law and war crime law governing that. I think, though, back when we were talking about this, we were talking about it in reference to the Marshal holding the Mandalorian armor and whether or not Mando had a legitimate claim to it. There's at least a much more colorable argument, I think, for the private right of ownership, right? That was, I'm trying to remember the name of the case, Altman versus the Republic of Austria, in which, it's someone who had originally possessed it or a descendant of that person who should have it by right of inheritance, right? Things like that. Actually trying to lay claim to a piece of property that was stolen during a war. That case, if anyone didn't listen to that episode, involved a descendant of a Jewish person who had been killed during the Holocaust and had an art collection. And this painting by Klimt was stolen by the Nazis. It was on display in a museum in Austria, and the descendant of that person who originally owned the art wanted it back. And they eventually won. And so when it came to the Marshall episode, it was, not really, Mando did not really have a colorful argument for that. His society, his culture had, some kind of possessive right that we recognize international law over those kinds of artifacts, perhaps. But he did not personally have that right that he would be able to reclaim it himself in sort of a private action. In this case, we'd have to kind of go back through the line of possession from the Mandalorian's perspective. It's possible that their laws of inheriting property involve, taking it by force. I don't know, things like that. Assuming that there's a legitimate line of possession and title, right, going to the Darksaber to Bo-Katan. I think she has both the weight as perhaps the representative of whatever sovereign nation there is of Mandalore now, and personally, having been the last Mandalorian in possession of the Darksaber, I think she would be able to bring both this sort of public right of action, where you'd maybe try to bring it before an international law tribunal of some kind, and the private right of action, that this once belonged to her, was taken during a battle, and she wants it back.
So there is this tradition with the Mandalorians that we see in the Clone Wars of, Saxon versus Darth Maul, and Maul kills Saxon, beheads him, and that's how Maul took over as the leader and also took possession of the Darksaber. I don't know if there was a duel between Gideon and Bo-Katan, which, again, that could actually be cool to see a lightsaber fight with if Gideon was using another lightsaber, perhaps a Jedi one or a Sith one, and just wielding that and going to town. Or if this was more like just off the battlefield after, say, a massive airstrike, and he then went in and picked up the pieces that he wanted. So we don't know. There's not enough facts there to know if it would fall under the traditions of Mandalorian, I'm now in charge, or if it's, the battlefield situation. I'm thinking it's battlefield, because I don't think Gideon would get his hands dirty in a fisticuffs directly with Bo-Katan.
Yeah, and I can't see him if she was holding a Darksaber and he was not.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Accurate.
It had to be like overwhelming force. Again, if she was in bed, like that's. I doubt she was sleeping in a bunker. It had to be, a surprise attack. Then, again, that's just fanboy speculation. But she seems far too competent to just lose it without taking some massive hit in the process, and that's how it was lost.
If I could add one comment as we start to, I assume, wrap this up. One of the things that I thought was interesting, and I would like you guys to add a little perspective for me since I haven't seen Clone Wars or Rebels, but I do understand enough of the lore to understand the significance of, Bo pointing out to Mando that, oh, you're one of those, you're one of the Watch, like meaning the Death Watch.
That cult.
And it does kind of, make a little sense given what we've seen of his original tribe, which is that they are very committed to sort of these very traditional Mandalorian principles. But what I found very interesting also was that it wasn't clear to me that, Bo-Katan was being presented in a particularly great light as the person seeking to be the next Mandalore, in the sense that, for example, trying to change the deal on him in the middle of this thing under great duress was not particularly honorable. And I understand, like, my basic understanding of the schism between the Death Watch and the other houses is that the Death Watch is not only more traditional, but more traditional in the sense that it's more martial. It seeks to do war. I imagine kind of Klingon-esque. That's the only way you can gain honor and go to heaven. As opposed to, right, like, you could still have these traditions of honor, but not necessarily think that the only way to gain honor is by killing enemies in battle. But Bo-Katan, by doing these other things, suggests in this episode to me that there are actually also problems with perhaps getting too far away from some of those traditions of honor. And I do find it interesting that in, more martial societies, like Klingons, like Mandalorians, and in more real world scenarios, like samurai and things like that, the honor part of this and the very formal legalistic kind of culture that is involved there kind of go hand in hand. And it seemed to me like Bo doing this less legalistic, oh, well, now we're going to take the ship and that's just how it goes, was kind of emblematic of that kind of schism. And I just wanted to know if you guys had any thoughts, like, are we supposed to be a little troubled by her lack of honor there? Is that consistent with what, she was portrayed as earlier media?
She was always really pragmatic. I mean, she was in league with the Death Watch before she finally broke with them when Maul took over. But she was always, after the fact, whatever she needed to do to accomplish an objective, it was almost as if this is what needs to be done. We need to do this for Mandalore, and everything else really just doesn't matter. It's a means to an end. And there's a great moment in this last season of the Clone Wars where they brought it back, and it's an arc involving the siege of Mandalore, where the Republic is helping, break control there. And the Republic had traditionally stayed out of Mandalorian affairs. There's like a 100-year-old treaty or something that they reference. And the prospect of the Republic getting involved in committing troops to this was like a big deal. And Obi-Wan is like very hesitant to do this sort of thing. And Bo-Katan's reaction is just like, we need your help. That end of story. Like, I really don't care what we're doing here, in terms of it, so long as it achieves our objective. And I think she is portrayed consistently here. And she may not care. I mean, to her, she had this sort of like a hilarious reaction to realizing, who he is as a Children of the Watch. Like, oh boy, like you're one of those guys. So I don't know if she doesn't know him and maybe doesn't have a whole lot of respect for him at this point. And quite frankly, she needs him for a bigger play.
Yeah, I think she's consistent. This is someone who lived through 2 wars. So she went through the Clone Wars and all that transpired with that, and then the Galactic Civil War. So this is someone who's went from being probably late teens, early 20s, as during the Clone Wars, to now late 40s, maybe 50 by this point in time in history. So she's seen a lot. She's gone through a lot. And, would have been like somebody who fought in both World War I and World War II and like is now entering like the Korean conflict. So, somebody clearly with a lot. She's
aged well.
Give me whatever she's taking.
Yeah, when you think of like, she was probably 10 years younger than Kenobi, and so she's definitely, not having the twin sons of Tatooine to prematurely age her. She's doing well. I think I agree with everything that Tom said. I don't see like an honor problem out of the gate. I do see like a wonderful comparison to, say, like the Protestant Reformation. So like if Din is following more conservative version of This Is the Way, and that could be like more like Catholic, and Bo-Katan is more like Lutheran or Episcopalian, of going like, yeah, you just have to believe in God. You don't have to pay your way into heaven. Like, that's not how this works. She's full on 95 Thesis of Martin Luther, compared to Din, who didn't know that happened. So like this goes to the big issue of like communication and education, because that's culture shock for him to go like, wait, we all don't do this. It's Tom and I were exchanging text messages, but it's like you find out like the thing that you based your entire life around, there's another interpretation, and that's a dangerous part of faith, when you find out that there are people who have different beliefs based upon the same thing. And I don't know if that's going to cause friction later, or if they'll find a way to normalize it, or if he'll learn that it's okay if I take off my helmet. It's okay if I get a haircut. I don't have to do this to myself. Like, it's not the end of honor. So, but again, it just highlights when you live in very different places and you don't have a communication system that unifies everyone. People can develop their own offshoots of what the message is.
Although, if I could just add one more thing, I think it can't be accidental that this happened, this episode in which Bo-Katan, changes the terms of an agreement in the middle of performance, happened right after the episode before, in which Frog Lady reminds Mando, you made this agreement. Mandalorians are supposed to be honor bound, unless these were all children's stories and none of it was true. And he, rallies himself and is, yes, I have to do this. I don't care if it kills me. And I can't imagine that that's accidental. And I don't mean to suggest that Bo is necessarily a bad character, but just that, this kind of harkens back to, I think, some episodes of Discovery or Picard where, there are certain things that are not your core principles that you can compromise on or adjust around, including the Prime Directive. But there are certain things that, you have to stick by them. And if you don't stick by them when it's difficult, when it's costly, and when it's extremely risky, then they're not really your core principles. And so in this case, Bo sacrificing what seems to be a pretty core principle of Mandalorian culture, which is just the honor bound. If you give your word, that's it. For the sake of pragmatism, even in a very important goal, which is to retake Mandalore. At least I was personally still quite troubled by that. And I think, just the contrast with the episode before, I'm not saying that Jin has everything right, and you definitely shouldn't take off your helmet. You're not a true Mandalorian. But there are parts of it that have to be core principles.
Yeah,
and one of them is keeping your word.
I see where you're coming from. And she might be rationalizing it that she is. Like okay, we now, which again, if this was just mission creep, I don't see it as her breaking her word. That if she realized in the middle of the mission, we're going to need to take the entire ship, I don't have a problem with that. If it was premeditated that I'm, lying in order to get his cooperation, that is problematic. Tom, do you have a thought on that?
I mean, I think it was premeditated. She knew that senior ranking officer would have information on where the Darksaber was. And so I go back to, and this kind of dovetails with Nari's comment, that from Bo-Katan's perspective, she's not sacrificing a core ideal. She's, the important thing is that they retake Mandalore, because without it, they are adrift as a society, adrift as a culture, adrift as a religion, for lack of a better term there. And the planet is a core part of their identity, that sovereign territory, and it always has been. And so from that standpoint, I think she looks at this situation and just says, call it what you will here. He could be upset at me, and other Mandalorians might take issue with how I did this, but there's a larger goal at play. And so I think she's rank ordering things in a way that makes sense to her. I also think she to some extent has the experience to know, the problems that sticking to certain ideals bring when you lose all reason to it. So the Mandalorians that stuck beside Maul and fought with him to the bitter end, because of their own interpretation of Mandalorian society and their viewpoints, she saw cause great destruction. It put their society under the boot heel, or under a very different boot heel for a while, just like the Mandalorians that aligned with the Empire did. And, I think at this point she's just done. She's 40, 50. She's seen 2 conflicts and her planet not have any peace whatsoever for decades. She's ready to put an end to it.
Yeah, I don't have a problem with her willingness to keep the end goal in mind, because she does state that we're stronger together or something along those lines. She wants to end Mandalorians just doing their own thing and we'll just be legends. It's like, okay, that's not a society. We're now just a legend and we want to be alive. And so I get that from a practical aspect. There's one thing to betray values, and I don't think she betrayed values, because I think she's keeping the ultimate goal of, we needed these weapons in order to retake the planet. We will retake our home. That makes sense. It'd be we're pretty big on, all men are created equal. When in the course of human events, there's certain things that rally Americans that go to who we are. We're used to being the heroes that fight bad guys. That sort of identity is not being violated, at least not yet. So I think she has the big goal of bring everyone together, retake the planet, right wrongs. And if that ends with Gideon's head on a pike, I don't think she's going to feel bad about that.
I'm just going to posit my slight disagreement here, which is, if the value then is Mandalorian nationalism, she's being very consistent. If the value is Mandalorian tradition or culture, which includes, I think, it has to include the honor element. I don't think that's consistent. Those two are separate things. And it's kind of you might end up winning the war, but if you end up winning the war by adopting the values of your enemy, did you really restore your nation?
I don't. Well, again, it's early, but I don't see the path that she's on as violating their core values, because.
Sure, and this was relatively small transgression with one person. I'm trying, and I don't want to make a mountain out of a molehill, but just we'll see where this goes. Maybe my disturbance in the Force here will presage something. And maybe
thinking to the Mandalorian themed episodes in Rebels and Clone Wars, I mean, it seems consistent. She's not. Well, again, there's a high body count. All the Imperials are dead by the end of the episode. I don't.
Sorry, I don't mean to also, I understand you guys have seen all these other media, and I have not gotten to know and love Bo-Katan like you have. So, I will also try to catch myself.
No, it's a fair criticism. If can you be on the run so long that you start betraying your values, or you forget who you are, and those are big weighty issues. There's also the fact that I might be tired of getting screwed by these guys, so we're gonna get our hands dirty in order to then be able to wash them off later. There's again, we'll see where she's going. So
yeah, I think, Nara, you make a really good point, because at some point she could turn into a Saw Gerrera type character. Maybe that's how she's been operating, right? Where you are so committed to an end state or a goal that you start to lose everything else, and you don't even realize that. You don't have the perspective to, and it's a destructive path. So I'll be very interested. I think Filoni's episode is number 5, so we're still 2 out from that. I think we'll at least see a peek of Ahsoka next episode, but I don't think the meat of her is going to come until Filoni's episode.
So little time to catch up, man.
Tom, I agree with your prediction, because they have to give Filoni the honor of putting Ahsoka on screen. Like that would just be weird not to.
He might have had that pre-written into his contract before they ever discussed story terms. Like, if any of the following characters, including but not limited to, and then Ahsoka's number 1 are included, I will direct the episode.
And it made sense that Favreau wrote and direct this one, since or not direct, but wrote this one because of his connection to the Mandalorians and having voiced one of them. And yeah, like that totally makes sense story-wise. And I mean, I appreciate the fact they keep the directors silent. Like, I didn't know Howard directed this one until the end. And I was very pleasantly surprised with, okay, she's good for her. Let's see who gets the next one and go from there. So yeah, there are many ways that they can go with this. If there's an Imperial fleet still floating around, that's a problem. And the beat up Razor Crest is not going to take that out by itself. And so I don't know how they're going to end this, where they're going to go with it. And is this teasing anything else that we might see? So that said, again, I watch it at 5:00 in the morning. So it's no other show have I done that for since early childhood. So good stuff. Good stuff. Yeah,
I know.
Can't wait till the next one.
Lamenting that it's a full week until it happens. I don't know what I'm going to do. Carbon freeze myself until Friday.
There's enough to do between now and then work-wise, and I'm in the middle of moving, so I have plenty to keep me busy. So,
actually, carbon freezing is a terrible idea to pass time, because I would want to be. You would have to be woken up with enough time to get over your carbon sickness, because otherwise you'd be blind. You couldn't see the episode. It'd be horrendous. The whole plan would go sideways.
Not everyone. Again, as we saw with Clone Wars, not everyone came out of it blind. So
that's true. With my luck, I would.
I don't know if I'd roll the dice on.
I'd be Han Solo. Like, just point me in the direction of the TV and describe what's happening.
He must have been there for a couple years, as opposed to like a couple days. So again, things to talk about. Well, everyone, thank you for tuning in. And, if you listen to us on iTunes, Stitcher, there's a and
very nice.
Thank you for tuning in. Please leave a review. And everyone, this is the way.